On a blistering summer day in 1867, the wind swept over the sun-scorched plains of West Texas, howling a mournful lament beneath a brazen sky. A lone figure on horseback galloped across this unforgiving terrain, eyes darting nervously, sweat staining the collar of his battered shirt. He was leaving something behind, something precious, and a spasm of guilt churned in his gut. Only hours before, this same man, driven by desperation and dark ambition, had cast away his own daughter like a broken toy into the mercy of the desert. He thought her end would come swiftly. He was wrong. Her destiny had other plans. The year was 1867, and the location was a rough trail branching off near Fort Concho, a bastion of the U.S. cavalry, poised on the banks of the Concho River in West Texas. The unrelenting sun blistered the land, turning vast open fields to a crisp, dusty brown. Any traveler venturing here faced the scorching breath of day and the chill kisses of night. Surviving meant knowing how to wring precious water from stubborn cacti and how to navigate territory claimed by both the Comanche people and the scattering of white settlers who had pushed westward. Carlton McAllister was one such settler. A rangy man in his early 40s, he wore his desperation in the lines of his eyes and the hollow set of his cheeks. Though he'd once owned a small ranch further east, misfortune and questionable choices had taken their toll. Debt had dogged his every footstep, and the shame of losing his land to a crooked gambler stung worse than a rattlesnake's bite. He had traveled west, hoping for a stroke of luck that might grant him a fresh start. Instead, the territory proved harsh, and no matter how far he fled, he couldn't outrun his gambling past. Beside him rode his daughter Eliza McAllister, a girl of barely 17 years, with auburn hair that caught the sun like embers in a dying fire. Eliza wore courage in her gaze, but she also carried the quiet sorrow of someone who had lost her mother too soon. She clung to the memory of gentler days, not yet grasping the gravity of her father's unraveling plans. Carlton's troubles had grown out of hand in the old settlement towns. His compulsive gambling overshadowed any shred of responsibility he should have felt as a father. Every time he'd place a bet, he was convinced it would be his salvation. But time and again, luck turned sour. When the official at the bank demanded he repay a portion of his staggering debt or risk jail time, Carlton swore to make one last wager that would solve all his problems. It was a card game in a dimly lit saloon near Fort Concho, a raucous place that smelled of whiskey, stale sweat, and gunpowder, from shootouts that flared as unpredictably as prairie fires. Carlton bet the last of his money, and then, in a final frenzy, gambled away the very horses he and Eliza rode. His gambler's face turned pale as the cards betrayed him. He lost, and with that loss came the ominous debt collection that trailed him like a hungry coyote. Now every step seemed haunted by the threat of bounty hunters or crooked lawmen who might lock him away. Under normal circumstances, he could have worked off the debt or found a ranch willing to hire him, but he had crossed too many lines, burned too many bridges. Desperation gnawed at his conscience. He looked at Eliza, recognizing that even if he found some remote place to hide the burden of caring for them, both weighed heavily. He was a man falling into an abyss, and in his distorted vision of survival, Eliza became expendable, a reminder of his failed responsibilities and a liability he no longer wanted to shoulder. Early one morning, before the sun had fully banished the stars, Carlton led Eliza deeper into the lonely wilderness. He told her it was to avoid any men who might be trailing him. She, trusting her father, followed without question. The land rose and fell in rolling hills of scrub grass and mesquite eventually opening into shallow canyons that cut through the rocky soil. The famed Comanche territory lay just beyond a stretch of land riddled with buffalo herds and ephemeral water sources. Even the bravest settlers feared traveling there without a strong cavalry escort. Eliza's eyes took in the changing landscape with wonder and a hint of worry. Despite her father's reassurance, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. She noticed how Carlton kept glancing back over his shoulder, as if an invisible demon clung to his trail. His grip on the reins was tight, his jaw set as though bracing himself to commit a final heinous act. When they reached a crooked, shallow ravine, dotted with juniper trees and strewn with rocks, Carlton dismounted. He took a moment to water the horses from a stagnant pool of rainwater. Eliza followed suit, scooping water into her cupped hands and splashing her face. She turned to find her father watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, a mix of regret, fear, and steeled resolve. Then he drew close, pressing a small parcel of dried jerky into her palm. "Stay here, girl," he rasped. I need to scout ahead." His voice trembled, betraying his guilt even as he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her with a stunned, sinking feeling in her chest. It didn't take long for Eliza to realize her father wasn't coming back. Minutes stretched into hours as the merciless sun climbed higher, scalding her skin, parching her throat. She paced back and forth along the creek bed, calling out for him until her voice turned hoarse. With each unanswered call, dread coiled tighter in her stomach. Why would her father do this? She thought back to the nights she'd seen him, losing hand after hand of cards, face contorted by desperations. She remembered hearing the hush of dire threats whispered in the saloon's dim corners. Perhaps he believed that abandoning her would lighten his burdens, or maybe it was some twisted act to keep her safe from the dangers chasing him. Yet the manner of her abandonment was as cold as the desert nights she would soon face. When she finally accepted that he was gone, she felt grief crash over her like a tidal wave. She wept until tears no longer came. By the time she tried to gather her wits and ration the few scraps of jerky he'd left, the day was already half gone. She knew she had to find shelter, or at the very least keep moving to conserve water, and keep her mind off the betrayal that churned inside her. Mounting her father's horse was not an option. He'd taken the better beast, leaving her only a pack mule too feeble for long distances. Fearful and alone, Eliza did the only thing she could. She forced herself to survive, clinging to the hope that she could somehow reach civilization or find a passing caravan before her strength gave out. As evening fell, the hot wind cooled, and Eliza pushed forward on foot, leading the tired mule behind her. The desert's twilight was a symphony of purples and reds brushed across the horizon, fleeting beauty in a harsh land that held no mercy for the weak. Shadows stretched across the dunes and gullies shapeless forms that stirred her imagination. Every whisper of wind through the brush made her start. Throughout the night, she walked beneath a sky shimmering with stars. Memories of her mother drifted to her. The gentle lullabies sung under a warm hearth, the small flower garden they once tended together. In those recollections, she found a flicker of strength. She refused to die out here without a fight. But survival was no simple matter. She was low on water, and what little jerky she had would do little to sustain her for more than a day. She drank sparingly from the mule's waterskin, rationing each mouthful. More concerning was the knowledge that she was likely trespassing on Comanche territory. Stories of war bands and horse-mounted raiders circulated widely in the saloons and among the frontier families. While many of these tales were exaggerated, the conflict between the U.S. Army and Comanche warriors was undeniably real and dangerous, With each step she weighed her odds. She wanted to find a settlement or a traveler's camp, yet dread of encountering a hostile war party clutched at her heart. Still, the desert was merciless, and even a threat of violent capture might be better than wasting away under the unrelenting sun. By midday of her second day alone, Eliza's body could endure no more. The punishing heat pressed down like a physical force, and she began to stumble as exhaustion overtook her. Sweat no longer beaded on her skin. It was as if her body had given up on trying to cool itself. Her lips were cracked, and her vision blurred at the edges. Once she tripped over a rock and fell hard, scraping her knees, but found no energy to rise immediately. She pressed on, counting her steps, until she saw something that might be a trick of the wavering heat. A small stand of trees, hugging a narrow creek bed at the base of a sandy bluff. Driven by a last burst of hope, she pushed forward, tugging the half-dead mule behind her. When she reached the trees, she collapsed beside a meager flow of water. Face first into the muddy bank. The muddy water tasted foul but offered life. So she drank, until her throat no longer felt like fire. She had no recollection of how long she lay in the mottled shade. Perhaps hours, perhaps half a day. But somewhere in that haze, fever, dreams plagued her. She saw her father sneering in the shadows, tossing the last coin across the saloon table. She saw her mother, gentle and kind, gazing at her with compassion that transcended death. At times, she thought she heard the beating of drums or the throaty cries of men on horseback, but she could not tell if it was real or the delirium of a mind on the brink of collapse. When she finally became aware of her surroundings, Eliza sensed another presence. A tall figure knelt beside her, silhouetted against the dying light of late afternoon. She tensed instinctively, heart pounding with a fresh surge of fear. Memories of all the frontier horror stories about Comanche raiders flooded her mind. But the man was not the savage monster her father's tales had warned of. True, he carried a lean, muscular frame and wore traditional Comanche garments, moccasins, leggings, a breechcloth and a vest adorned with tribal beadwork. His hair fell past his shoulders, and in the subtle light she noticed a solemn kindness in his eyes. He did not speak at first, instead offering her a water skin. Weak as she was, Eliza fumbled for it, gulping until she coughed. The man watched over her with quiet vigilance, seeming to gauge if she posed any threat. She tried to speak, but could only rasp out a broken word of thanks. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and tinged with an accent she had never heard before. "You are alone." She nodded, tears suddenly threatening. Here was a stranger, likely her only lifeline in a landscape that had already claimed so many lives. Swallowing her fear, she managed to whisper her name. He introduced himself as Tahlequah, a name Eliza struggled to pronounce. It meant quiet bear. He explained haltingly in English, an inherited name from his grandfather. Perhaps in some cosmic twist of destiny, their paths were meant to cross. Tahlequah knew this territory intimately. He had grown up among these canyons, following the migrating herds of buffalo, respecting the land that provided for his people. His presence here alone was part of a spiritual quest, proving himself in solitude, communing with the spirits of his ancestors for guidance. Running across a half-dead white girl was the last thing he expected. Still, the Comanche Code of Honor was clear to rescue. Those who are helpless is a virtuous act, even if they are of the same people who threaten his own Tahlequah, had heard many stories of betrayal and bloodshed at the hands of settlers. But also he'd witnessed kindness. He remembered once stumbling upon a rancher's widow who offered him a loaf of bread and a place by the fire when a storm raged. To him, kindness transcended old wounds. Eliza, for her part, marveled at the man who had so unexpectedly come to her aid. She was overwhelmed by cultural differences and her own swirling emotions. Relief, fear, confusion, and gratitude all mixed into one potent storm. But she recognized goodness when she saw it, and Tahlequah's decision to help her shone like a beacon of hope after the crushing betrayal she had just endured. Despite their limited, shared language, Tahlequah motioned for Eliza to follow him. He helped her stand, supporting her frail frame. Her legs quivered from exhaustion, and he quickly realized she was in no condition to walk long distances. Carefully he guided her to his horse, lifted her onto its back, and led her deeper into Comanche territory, with a calm resolve. As dusk settled, Tahlequah led Eliza through an ancient network of trails that crisscrossed hidden valleys and snaked between rugged outcrops of sandstone. With each step of the horse's hooves, Eliza felt her anxiety bubble up. She'd grown up hearing stories that painted native tribes as ruthless or cunning, but her immediate experience was proving otherwise. Tahlequah was considerate, ensuring she had enough water, and pausing often when her breathing grew labored. The pack mule trudged behind them, somehow grateful for the guidance of a stronger hand. The night sky above was a vast canvas of stars, shimmering in a way Eliza had never before witnessed. Without the distracting glow of any settlement, the heavens felt overwhelmingly close. She held on to the saddle horn, trying to steady her nerves. Exhaustion tugged at her, but her thoughts refused to quiet. Eventually they came upon a small clearing near a bend in a shallow river. Tall cottonwoods stood as guardians of the water's edge, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. Tahlequah motioned that they would rest here for the night. He tethered his horse and Eliza's mule, then gathered dry branches to start a small fire. She observed him, noting the graceful efficiency in the way he moved. Every gesture had a purpose, shaped by a lifetime of living alongside nature's rhythms. Before sleep claimed her, Eliza managed to say, "Thank you one more time." It was a simple phrase, yet the earnest gratitude in her voice carried a depth of emotion that words alone could not convey. Tahlequah nodded, watching over her as she succumbed to slumber. When dawn broke, Eliza awoke to find Tahlequah already stirring quietly, cooking strips of venison over the embers. She tried to rise, but aches racked her body from head to toe. Tahlequah handed her a small portion of meat and a few berries he'd foraged nearby. The food tasted divine compared to the stale jerky she'd been living on. He led her onward, guiding the horse over a winding path that gradually climbed into higher ground. Around midday the terrain leveled out, revealing a broad plateau dotted with buffalo grass and brush. In the distance, faint plumes of smoke indicated a settlement. His people's camp, perhaps? Eliza's heart quickened. As they approached the encampment, a cluster of teepees came into view, flanked by horses grazing lazily. Groups of Comanche men, women and children paused their routines to stare at the unlikely sight, one of their own, returning with a weary white girl clinging to the saddle. Rumblings of disapproval and hushed whispers wafted through the air. Eliza could not understand the language, but the tension was unmistakable. A few braves armed with spears and bows rushed forward, surrounding Tahlequah and Eliza. There were sharp, questioning tones, gestures pointing at Eliza. Tahlequah responded calmly, though his voice carried an edge of urgency. Eliza's pulse pounded. She realized she was entirely at their mercy, yet Tahlequah's posture spoke of resolve. He had brought her here determined to ensure she was not left to perish. Whether his people would accept her or cast her out remained to be seen under the broad shade of a large cottonwood The Comanche leaders assembled. An elderly man named Pahayuka, whose eyes still glowed with fierce intelligence, sat cross-legged on the ground, gesturing for Talakwa to speak. Although Eliza understood none of the conversation, she sensed the gravity of the proceedings in every measured glance. Every curt nod, men with proud bearing stood in a ring, arms folded or resting on weapons. The women and children gathered at a respectful distance, observing with eyes that flickered between curiosity and fear. Talakwa's voice rose in earnest explanation. Eliza caught her own name mentioned as he looked in her direction. Some of the men frowned. Others barked words that caused Talakwa to answer in calm but insistent tones. The tension grew palpable, and Eliza's fear spiked anew. Would they banish her? Had Talakwa risked his own standing among his people to save her? Finally, Pahayuka spoke slowly and decisively, holding up a hand to still the debate. He turned his gaze to Eliza, studying her with a kind of grandfatherly sternness. Then he nodded to Talakwa and uttered a short statement that Eliza sensed was some form of conditional acceptance. The circle broke, and the gathered onlookers began to disperse. Talakwa helped Eliza to her feet. Though his eyes remained composed, she sensed relief emanating from him. Wordlessly, he guided her further into the camp. It seemed she had been granted a reprieve, if not a warm welcome, then at least a chance to heal and prove herself not a threat. In the days that followed, Eliza remained in a small tipi set up at the far edge of the camp, likely to keep her separate until the tribe's elders decided otherwise. A stern but capable medicine woman named Wanale, whose leathery skin and bright eyes spoke of a life lived under the open sky, came to examine Eliza daily. She tended to the girl's wounds, applied crushed herbs to her bruises and infected scrapes, and murmured incantations to ward off evil spirits. Though Eliza understood almost no Comanche words, she learned to pick up on small cues: Wanale's gentle touch, her nods of approval. Talakwa visited too, bringing small gifts of food or fresh water. Through halting English and hand gestures, he explained that Wanale was revered in the tribe for her healing powers. Eliza felt an unspoken bond forming between her and these strangers who had shown her more kindness than her own flesh and blood. During her convalescence, she observed the daily life of the camp from the opening of her tipi. She saw mothers caring for children, men returning with game from the hunt, older warriors tending to horses. She witnessed laughter and music arguments and discussions. Gradually, she realized that these were not the fearsome caricatures she had been told about since childhood. They were families, individuals with hopes and hardships of their own. One evening, Talakwa appeared with a small bowl of broth flavored with wild onions. He offered it to her and smiled. "Stronger now," he said, tapping his chest to indicate that her body was healing. Eliza gave him a grateful nod. A subtle warmth spread in her heart, a seed of trust that took root in a place she never expected. As Eliza regained her strength, she ventured outside her tipi to explore the camp under Talakwa's discreet guidance. She learned the rudimentary basics of Comanche greetings, stumbling over unfamiliar sounds, but finding delight in every small success. A few children curious about the pale-skinned stranger followed her around, giggling whenever she fumbled the words. She would laugh in return, appreciating their unfiltered joy. Though some of the adults remained wary, a handful of women, likely emboldened by Wanale's acceptance, offered lessons in practical tasks: grinding corn, drying meat, braiding rope, and other daily chores that sustained the community Eliza raised on a small farm. Before her father's gambling consumed their lives, found some familiarity in these tasks. The differences lay in the tools and techniques, but the underlying principles of survival were universal. Tend to your food supply, care for your animals, respect your neighbors. Tahlequah showed her how to care for horses in the Comanche way, teaching the tribes deep reverence for the animals that carried them across the plains. She stroked the sleek neck of Tahlequah's mare, whispering gentle words. Over time, she realized the horse was as much a partner in the Comanche lifestyle as any family member, a relationship of mutual dependence shaped by countless generations. The more she engaged with the rhythms of life, here the more Eliza began to heal, not just physically, but also emotionally. The bitterness toward her father's betrayal lingered, but it was tempered by gratitude toward Tahlequah and the calm acceptance of a people who had every reason to distrust a stranger in their midst. Some fires are lit by hatred, others burn from love. The wind that morning was uneasy, restless, almost as if it sensed the blood to come. Tahlequah stood just outside the camp circle, sharpening a blade under the pale gold of dawn. Eliza was nearby, laughing quietly, with a young Comanche girl who had taken to braiding her hair in long, patient strokes. It was a moment of peace that neither of them took for granted. Every smile, every shared word was hard-won against history and blood. But peace, like still water, is always the most vulnerable just before the stone strikes. The first rifle crack tore through the air like a whip. Eliza flinched, dropping the strand of hair she had been holding. Tahlequah was already on his feet, blade forgotten, hand reaching for his bow. The shout of a scout rang through the camp, 3 sharp calls, then silence. Riders from the east. Panic spread like wildfire. Women grabbed children. Men leapt to gather weapons. Elders shouted in Comanche, calling out orders, guiding the young toward the ravine trail. Tahlequah grabbed Eliza's wrist. "Go," he said, eyes locked with hers. "You know the path. Take the girl. Run." But Eliza didn't move. She was staring past him toward the rising cloud of dust, where horses surged into view. Men atop them armed with long rifles and the fury of fear. Settlers' ranchers. Some of them familiar faces from the frontier towns, and in their eyes nothing but hate. "They came for me," Eliza breathed. No, Tahlequah said. "They came for us." The first volley struck the camp moments later. Smoke bloomed as tents caught fire. Dogs barked wildly. Arrows loosed from Comanche. Bows met bullets in midair. A young warrior crumpled just feet from Eliza. A bullet through his chest. She screamed. Tahlequah shoved her behind a wagon. "Stay here," he growled, not unkindly. Then he was gone, racing toward the battle line bow, in hand, moving like water between trees and fire. Eliza's heart thrashed in her chest. Her hands trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to run to survive. But when she peeked over the wagon, her eyes locked on Tahlequah. In the distance, his back bent in protection, over a fallen boy, arrows flying from his bow like lightning. He was defending them. All of them. He was defending her. Suddenly she stood and ran straight into the line of fire. Voices called out, hands tried to grab her, but she was faster, guided by fear, love and rage, all braided into one. Bullets hissed past her ears. She didn't flinch. A settler on horseback caught sight of her, raised his rifle, then blinked in confusion. "Eliza!" he shouted. It was Amos Grady, her father's old friend. He lowered his gun in disbelief. "You're with them?" Eliza stood tall, chest heaving. "They saved me. Not you. Not anyone from your town. They're savages," he spat. "You don't belong with them. You left me to die," she screamed back. "Tahlequah found me starving, freezing, and he chose mercy." Behind her, the camp burned. Children cried. Men died. I choose them now, she said. And with that, she stepped in front of a Comanche woman, shielding her infant, spreading her arms wide. Stop shooting, she shouted voice. Raw. You're killing families, not warriors. Another gunshot rang out. Dust kicked up beside her foot. A man shouted, She's gone native, she's one of them. A few rifles lowered, a few didn't. But in that moment, she held the line. Tahlequah reached her side. Seconds later, sweat streaming down his brow. Hands bloodied from the fight. You should have run, he said. I won't leave you. He stared at her chest, rising and falling, then placed a hand on her shoulder. Then we stand together, slowly as more settlers recognized. Eliza recognized that this wasn't a kidnapping or brainwashing, but a woman who had chosen their fire wavered. Their certainty cracked. The leader, a grizzled rancher with a scar down his cheek, raised his rifle to the sky and fired one shot. Enough, he barked. We didn't ride out to kill a girl. Pull back, one by one. The riders retreated, shame and confusion in their wake. The damage had been done, but the massacre had been stopped. Smoke still hung in the air. The cries of the wounded still pierced the silence. But the camp was not gone. They had survived. Tahlequah turned to Eliza, his voice low. You risked your life, so did you. She whispered. They stood there among the ashes, surrounded by survivors, and the weight of what almost was. And in their silence, there was more than just relief. There was the knowledge that something powerful had changed, and it would never be undone. In the weeks that followed, the tension grew palpable around Fort Concho, and the nearby settlements, rumors of a Comanche kidnapping, spread like wildfire kindled by Carlton's fabricated account. Ranchers locked their doors at night. Mothers kept children indoors, and men sharpened their rifles, half expecting a war party to descend at any moment. At the fort, a jittery commander named Captain Lynch listened to the increasingly frantic pleas of local settlers. He had orders from higher-ups to maintain peace treaties where possible. But if outraged citizens demanded a reaction, ignoring them could cost him his post. On top of that, the Army's relationship with the Comanche people was already on shaky ground, with sporadic raids and counter-raids, fueling mutual distrust. Bo Calloway, the deputy, took it upon himself to raise a volunteer posse. Driven by personal vendetta and the false hero's quest to save Eliza, he recruited local cowhands, ranchers, and a few men with questionable moral compasses, but plenty of guns. Under the guise of rescue, they prepared for violence. Their numbers grew daily, each new addition fanned by the stirring speeches of righteous retribution. Carlton observed this mounting storm with a mixture of relief and trepidation. While he had set the wheels in motion to ensure no one would discover his crime, the weight of guilt pressed down on him. He drank more heavily, evading direct involvement in the posse, but periodically feeding them new lies to keep their rage aflame. The line between reality and fiction blurred in his own mind. But one thing remained certain. If a confrontation occurred, Eliza would either be lost in the chaos or forced to remain silent forever. News traveled in subtle ways across the plains. Through traders, scouts, and occasional alliances, hints of impending hostility reached Tahlequah's camp. One morning, a young warrior returned from a hunting trip near the settler towns, reporting that a large group of armed men was preparing for an expedition. The rumor said they were out for blood, citing a kidnapped girl as the reason. The clan elders convened once more under the shade of the cottonwood. Pahayuka listened intently to the young warrior's story, his wrinkled brow furrowing with concern. Among Comanche rumors of a settler army, assembling usually spelled trouble of the worst kind. Memories of past betrayals, Treaties, broken, families, slaughtered, echoed through the collective consciousness. Like a haunting refrain, Tahlequah glanced toward Eliza, who stood nearby, her face paling as she sensed the gravity of the discussion. She had begun to pick up a few more words of Comanche by now, and recognized the repeated mention of something akin to posse or soldiers. Then someone uttered a phrase that sounded like her name. Instinctively, all eyes turned to her. She stiffened under the weight of their gazes. In her gut, she knew who was behind this. Despite her father's betrayal, she also recognized that any armed group scouring the plains for a kidnapped girl was far more likely to annihilate an entire Comanche band than calmly negotiate the horrors she had feared might become a devastating reality unless she found a way to prevent it. Gathering what courage she could muster, Eliza stepped forward. The blood pounded in her ears. But she remembered Tahlequah's patient lessons in speaking Comanche, albeit in broken fragments. She pointed to herself, then mimicked riding a horse and rummaging through the desert alone. Through a halting mix of gestures and words, she tried to convey that she had not been kidnapped, but abandoned. Pahayuka's eyes narrowed with curiosity. The elders leaned in. Tahlequah helped her by interpreting the English words she sprinkled into her plea, though his own English was limited. A hush fell over the gathering. As the truth began to unfold, Eliza's father had left her in the wilderness to die, and now he was claiming she had been taken by the Comanche, rousing the settlers to storm the camp. Eliza's voice trembled with indignation as she tried to describe her father's desperate, treacherous nature. Through Tahlequah's translations, the elders learned that far from saving a daughter, the posse sought bloodshed under a false pretense. Everyone in the circle understood what was at stake. Innocent lives could be lost if the settlers marched in with their rifles blazing, convinced they were delivering justice. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Some frowned deeply, eyes dark with anger at the deception others cast worried glances at the sky, as if the ancestors themselves might weigh in on this impending crisis. Finally, Pahayuka lifted his hand, signaling for silence. He looked at Tahlequah, then at Eliza. War might be inevitable, but perhaps truth could avert the worst outcome. If only they could prove Eliza's story before the bullets started flying. Soon a plan formed. Tahlequah would lead a small group to intercept the posse before it reached the camp if he presented Eliza to them alive and clearly unharmed. Perhaps the settlers would stand down, but Pahayuka warned them to prepare for violence. Words were often ignored when men's hearts were set on vengeance. Still, it was the best chance to avoid a slaughter. Eliza insisted on accompanying Tahlequah. She dreaded facing her father again, but she also knew she was the only one who could expose his lie. The elders debated the risk bringing Eliza closer to the armed posse could lead to her capture or worse. Ultimately, her testimony was the key. With reluctant acceptance, they consented to her going, provided Tahlequah and the others shielded her if negotiations failed. In hushed conversations around the campfires that night, men sharpened their bows and prepared their horses, while women packed provisions for the journey. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, sensing the unease that rippled through the entire camp. Eliza found sleep elusive. Her mind churned with visions of confrontation, hot lead flying through the air. Men's war cries echoing, and her father's voice weaving more lies. Just before dawn, Tahlequah and 4 other warriors departed on horseback. Eliza rode behind Tahlequah, clinging to him with trembling hands. They carried no white flags, nor did they hoist a war banner. The fate of 2 worlds lay in their attempt to bring truth to men who might be deaf to it, blinded by hate and fear. They rode hard through the rising sun, following dusty trails that snaked toward the frontier town. Along the way they paused to observe tracks, hoofprints from what appeared to be more than a dozen horses. The posse was close. By midday they caught sight of a gathering of men near a cluster of boulders and a dried creek bed. Rifles and shotguns gleamed in the sunlight, a glaring sign of their deadly intent. Tahlequah and his companions approached cautiously. Eliza's heart thrummed in her throat. As they drew nearer, the posse spotted them. Shouts rose and men scrambled for cover, positioning their firearms. Beau Calloway stood at the forefront, rifle in hand, his face contorted with hostility. Nearby, leaning against a horse with a whiskey flask in hand, was Carlton. McAllister, Carlton's jaw dropped when he recognized Eliza alive, perched behind a Comanche warrior. His face paled for an instant, eyes bulging with shock and something akin to terror, but then the corners of his mouth twisted into a sneer, as if he might once again spin a quick lie to extricate himself. "Hold your fire," Calloway barked to his men. Though some still aimed their rifles warily, Eliza slid off the horse knees, quaking. She took a shaky step forward, clearing her throat. Her gaze landed on her father, whose features hardened as if bracing himself for a storm. Silence settled over the makeshift battlefield, thick with anticipation. Everything depended on what she would say, and on whether these armed men would bother to listen. Eliza drew in a breath, then shouted, so all could hear. "I wasn't kidnapped. My father left me to die." Her words reverberated across the dusty clearing, ripping through the tension like a bullet. Carlton's lips parted in a strained half-grin, but his eyes burned with panic. Calloway's face scrunched with confusion and anger, while the men around him exchanged startled glances. Eliza pressed forward, her voice trembling, yet resolute. "I wandered in the desert after he abandoned me. The Comanche found me. They saved my life." She pointed at Tahlequah and the other warriors. "These men are not killers. They've shown me more kindness than my own father ever did," Carlton spluttered, stepping forward with arms raised in a theatrical gesture. "That's a damn lie. The Comanche attacked our wagon and took you by force. She's been brainwashed or threatened. She doesn't know what she's saying." He feigned a look of paternal concern, but beads of sweat betrayed him. Calloway's eyes flicked between Eliza, the armed Comanche, and the increasingly agitated posse behind him. Soot swirled on his features. "Is that true, girl? You sure you ain't just saying what they told you to say?" Eliza's temper flared at the insinuation. "I'm telling the truth. My father gambled away everything we had. He left me for dead so he could escape his debts. These people had every reason to leave me, but they didn't. They cared for me, fed me, and brought me here to end this madness." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Tahlequah raised a hand, speaking softly in halting English. "No war, no kill. We come. Talk." His expression was calm, resolute, a stark contrast to the roiling emotions swirling around him. All eyes turned back to the so-called father who had orchestrated this entire tragedy. Carlton's mind raced. The house of cards he'd built was collapsing in front of an armed posse, ready for blood. Desperation oozed from his every pore. He glanced at the men assembled around him, men incensed at the thought of a kidnapped girl. If he lost their support, he faced not only their wrath, but also the judgment of the law, assuming the law cared enough to intervene. I only did what any father would do," he stammered. "These savages threatened to kill me if I didn't leave Eliza. They forced me to blame them so they could blame me. Don't you see? It's all a trick. His disjointed defense only sowed confusion. Some men shifted uneasily, while a few spat on the ground in disgust. A heavy-set rancher named Morris stepped forward, removing his hat. "Doesn't sit right with me, McAllister," he said, eyes narrowing. "We was fixin' to ride out and kill. God knows how many people just 'cause you told us they snatched your daughter. Now she says you abandoned her. Something's real off here." Carlton's face hardened with fury. "Are you calling me a liar after all I've been through?" He leveled a shaking hand at Eliza. "She's under their spell. Can't you see? They must have put fear in her heart, made her speak these lies to spare them." From her vantage point, Eliza caught the flicker of recognition in her father's eyes. He knew his ruse was failing, but he clung to it desperately, calculating whether he could still manipulate these men to save his own skin. Little did he know the unstoppable momentum of truth was about to slam into him with devastating force. The silence that followed was tense enough to snap like a dry twig. Then one of the posse members, a lanky youth who couldn't have been older than 20, piped up Mr. McAllister. "You said these Comanche used her as a ransom, but she looks clean and well-fed. If they was gonna harm her, she wouldn't look like that." He gestured at Eliza's clothing, worn but clearly cared for, and at the few beaded trinkets she'd been given in friendship. Other men murmured in agreement. Eliza felt a faint glimmer of hope. Still, the collective had come armed and expectant of a fight. Some seemed unwilling to let go of their thirst for vengeance. Then Beau Calloway, the deputy, cleared his throat. A hush fell again. "Girl," he said, squinting at Eliza, "if you can prove your father gambled away your future and left you to die, speak up, but talk sense. Did anyone see him do it? Any witness to back you up?" Eliza's face drained. She realized she had no tangible proof except her own testimony. No one would testify against her father in a dusty frontier town where he'd likely burned any records or evidence of his debts. She caught Talakwa's eye, feeling a quiver of despair. Could they still believe her? Carlton seized the moment, stepping forward with renewed bravado. "You see, she has nothing. Just the word of these Sov." His slur was cut short by a sudden roar of anger from one of Talakwa's companions. The warrior stepped forward, voice rough with indignation, though the exact words were lost on the white men. Tension soared. Fingers tightened on rifle triggers. Eliza trembled. The confrontation poised at a perilous tipping point, where even a single wrong word could unleash a hail of bullets. Just as violence threatened to erupt, Talakwa raised his arms high, positioning himself between the armed posse and his infuriated Comanche brother. In slow, deliberate English, he began to speak, mixing it with Comanche words to bridge the gap. "I am Talakwa," he said, voice steady. "I found Eliza alone, almost dead in the desert. No father, no men, only her. Tears. She had no water, no horse. She was alone." He gestured to the horizon, where the scorching plains stretched out mercilessly. Bad place. Too hot, she would die. We help his simple phrases lacked the flourish of an orator, but their sincerity rang clear, each word hit with the quiet force of truth. Beau Calloway stared hard at Talakwa, then at Eliza, perhaps judging whether these two were cunning enough to concoct a lie so consistent and so simple. Carlton's voice quivered with desperation. You don't know what you're talking about. They ambushed us. They killed our horses." A sudden bark of anger from a different posse member cut him off, damn it. "McAllister, your story keeps changing. You said you outran them on horseback. Then you said they took your horses. Which is it?" The group's patience with Carlton was wearing thinner by the second. In a final move of panic, Carlton reached for his revolver. Maybe he thought he could force the narrative by brandishing a gun. Maybe he was simply cornered his mind, unraveling in the face of the growing consensus that he was a liar. Whatever his intent, it was the spark that could ignite a fiery conflict if no one acted quickly. Time seemed to slow as Carlton's hand jerked toward his holster. Several things happened at once. Men in the posse raised their rifles. Tahlequah and his warriors moved defensively, and Eliza screamed. No, Carlton managed to free the revolver, but before he could raise it to aim a shot, rang out Bo Calloway's rifle, spat fire, and the bullet smashed into Carlton's shoulder. With a pained howl, he tumbled to the ground, revolver clattering across the stones. Chaos ensued, some posse members startled, nearly fired in reflex. Others rushed to hold them back, shouting, "Hold your fire!" In seconds the dust settled. Carlton lay writhing in agony, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Eliza stood frozen tears pricking her eyes as she witnessed the man who had betrayed her. Now helpless Tahlequah stepped forward carefully, ensuring no one else would shoot, while the other Comanche warriors hovered with arrows nocked, awaiting any further threat. Bo Calloway approached, face pale but resolute. I had to," he muttered, as though trying to convince himself as much as anyone. He looked at Eliza. He was fixing to kill you, or maybe to start a shootout that'd kill us all. Slowly the rest of the posse lowered their weapons. The truth had become undeniable. Carlton McAllister had orchestrated this entire mess, and it nearly led to bloodshed on a massive scale. Now he lay on the ground, moaning in pain, paying the price for his treachery. Some might say it was frontier justice, doled out by the very men he sought to manipulate. Eliza knelt beside her wounded father. Despite everything, his betrayal, his lies, his attempt to turn a posse into a murderous mob, he was still the man she had known as a child. Memories of him teaching her how to tie a lasso, how to ride a pony flickered through her mind. A swirl of grief, rage, and pity enveloped her. She found herself sobbing, torn between wanting him to suffer for what he'd done and the instinct to help. Tahlequah watched with an inscrutable expression while one of his companions looked on in disdain. To them, Carlton was a man who had threatened their very lives. Yet in the Comanche code, once he was disarmed, he was no longer an immediate threat. Bo Calloway stooped, pressing a cloth to Carlton's wound. "We'll take him back to town," he said, through gritted teeth, addressing Eliza and Tahlequah. "He'll stand trial for inciting violence, attempted murder, and whatever else the judge sees fit." No one objected. The posse members, shame-faced and weary, began to gather themselves. Some exchanged nods with Tahlequah's warriors, a silent acknowledgement of shared relief that the conflict ended with minimal bloodshed. Eliza stood wiping tears from her cheeks. She felt a light hand on her shoulder and turned to see Tahlequah. In his dark eyes, she saw empathy and something akin to pride. She had stood against falsehood and protected innocent lives. For the first time, she dared to hope that the two worlds, the Comanche camp she had come to cherish and the frontier town that symbolized her past, might find some peace. The ride back to town was somber. Calloway's posse escorted Carlton, who lay slumped over a horse, bleeding and cursing under his breath. Tahlequah and his companions followed at a distance, making sure no new hostilities flared. Eliza alternated between riding beside the Comanche warrior who had saved her and speaking softly to the townsmen, who now realized how close they had come to being unwitting executioners. By the time they reached the outskirts, dusk painted the sky in a tapestry of crimson and gold. Word of the posse's return spread quickly. People gathered in clusters, whispering or gawking. The sight of a white girl riding with Comanche warriors defied their expectations. Yet there was no immediate panic. Perhaps the open presence of the deputy and the subdued posture of the Comanche offered reassurance. As Carlton was taken to the makeshift jail in a converted barn, Eliza provided a statement to the local justice of the peace. Though not a formal court, it was enough to hold her father accountable until a proper judge could preside. She recounted the gamble, the desert abandonment, and the manipulative lies that nearly led to an unjust massacre. Tahlequah stood by her stoic, waiting in silence. When asked if he or his people wished to press charges or demand retribution, he simply shook his head. Justice in his eyes was letting truth surface and letting the man be dealt with by his own society's laws. That night, with the threat lifted, Tahlequah and his warriors prepared to depart. Eliza found herself torn. A part of her longed to ride with them back to the open plains she had come to see as home. Yet she knew her testimony might still be needed, and the frontier town offered the only formal process for bringing her father to account. In the end, Tahlequah offered a small smile, placing in her hand a beaded bracelet Wanale had made. "For you," he said. "You are strong," with that he and his warriors rode off under the moonlight, leaving Eliza with the promise that she would not be alone in her new chapter. In the aftermath, the settlement near Fort Concho discovered a new perspective on the people they once feared. Carlton McAllister faced judgment for his crimes, and the lies he spun unraveled before the entire community. His hard karma arrived in the form of a locked cell and the scorn of neighbors who now knew the depth of his betrayal. Meanwhile, Eliza chose a future that bridged two worlds, advocating for understanding between frontier settlers and the Comanche. Through her bond with Tahlequah, she carried hope that a fragile peace could mend past wounds. If you found yourself captivated by Eliza's tale of betrayal, courage, and redemption, please support this story by liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Your engagement helps bring more frontier dramas and historical adventures to life. Join us as we continue to explore the untamed spirit of the Wild West and the resilient hearts that shaped it. Thank you for watching.